Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this IORMA webinar. I appreciate that it takes a minute or two for everyone to be able to get access to the webinar. So whilst we're waiting to start, I'd just like to say a few words about IORMA and the purpose of this webinar. The IORMA Global Consumer Commerce Centre is a neutral resource for business and governments that recognises the need to understand and respond to the ways in which the 7.7 billion global consumers are changing. And they're changing in the products and services they want and need and the ways they want to obtain them. And these changes are happening globally, driven by developments in society, in business and technology. Well, we have all of our panelists in the room at the moment. So what I'm going to do is to switch over to the gallery view. And I'm going to now hand over to Beverly Nielsen, who's going to introduce the participants, and she will look after you very ably throughout this webinar. Over to you, Beverly.
Thanks so much. Thanks for that really generous introduction, David, and delighted to be moderating today's discussion on reshoring and the importance of our supply chain and what's been happening. Now, we've got a fantastic panel today. I'm really, really delighted that we're joined by Julia Moore, who is CEO of GTMA and Reshoring UK. We've got James Stevens, who is Director of Global Government and External Affairs at Aston, Lagonda. And we've got Roger Willison-Gray, Corporate Relations Director at IORMA. I'm Beverly Nielsen. I'm Director of the Institute for Design and Economic Acceleration at Birmingham City University. I have an interest actually in both supply chains and manufacturing, but especially incubation and acceleration of startup businesses. And I'm pleased to say, and this discussion is very close to my heart because I've written about redesigning manufacturing. And so I think that there's plenty of scope for us in today's discussion. So really, I'd like to move pretty much straight away to Julia Moore, who has got a lifetime's experience in this area as CEO of GTMA and Reshoring UK. Julia, can you just tell us why this subject is particularly close to your heart in light of your experience and what you see as the priorities for us just at the present time with the pandemic and the crisis we are confronted with?
Good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to be here and joining you all today. Just a very brief overview. GTMA is an engineering trade association. We represent tool making and the wider precision engineering market in the UK. Trade associations represent specialist skills, of which they are a very underrated resource, I think, in this country. The unique position that they hold is that they understand their industry sector and represent specialist engineering skills. These skills are so often hidden from the manufacturers. You've only got to browse on the internet to see the deluge of information that obscures your search. The Reshoring Network represents these specialist trade associations and their members, and reshoring provides the vision and location of these skills across the UK, all in one place. Today, the network boasts of 26 engineering and industry organisations, which range from the Cast Metals Federation to Composites UK, from surface engineering to turned parts, and from rail to health tech sectors. Over recent months of the lockdown, we've all seen the issues that have suddenly shown in our supply chains, not only in industry, but it has touched and affected the wider population. Our supply chain in the UK has been for so long outsourced that without the call to the SMEs and their quick response to the situation, this situation could have been far worse. SMEs are agile and they have a can-do approach. And what this crisis has shown is that manufacturers need to consider dual sourcing and bringing back part production to the UK. The carbon footprint plays a part in this decision. British quality and innovation plays one part. And another is the dependence, that we have all seen on outsourcing our production. Security for global production can be seriously affected by one critical component, bottleneck, often brought about by global shocks. In our own memories, we have seen and experienced many. The devastation from the collapse of financial markets, the oil industry, wars, the Islamic volcanic ash eruption, Southeast Asia, microchips, and a man-made nuclear disaster, and indeed other weather disasters. All have in their time had a global impact on manufacturing, and of course, indirectly and directly, the well-being of the population across the world. Manufacturers obviously do risk assessments on their impact on potential global bottlenecks that can occur and on their production. But what we do now need is to put in place dual sourcing for the UK's future protection. As one of the important issues to come out of the lessons we have learned during this crisis is to secure the UK against future shocks. Reshoring UK, we hope, will at least provide a network to our manufacturers across the whole of the UK and continue the important collaboration of working closer together to play an essential part for the UK to sustain our manufacturing base and, importantly, to retain the existing engineering skills in the UK. Thank you, Beverly.
Thanks so much for that, Julia. That was really comprehensive and I think sort of sets us up for the discussion really well. Now, I'd like to move now to James Stevens as Director of Global Government and External Relations at Aston Martin Lagonda. Obviously, you've been through a tremendous period of change internally in the business, James, but there's huge external change, and we were just very briefly touching on some of that in terms of the environmental prerogative, the customer trends that you're confronting. Would you like to tell us a little bit about how you have been affected by these trends and your priorities at the present time, and most especially why this is such a key area for Aston Martin at the present time?
Sure. Thank you, Beverly, and good afternoon, everybody. Obviously, Aston Martin is a small luxury automotive manufacturer. We have 3 sites in the UK that manufacture cars. Our historic home in Newport Pagnell, our current headquarters and home of our sports car manufacturer in Gaydon, Warwickshire, and where I have been this morning, South Wales, St Athan, our new home for our SUV, and I'm glad to say that our first SUV came off the production line only at 10 o'clock this morning. So we're delighted that we have now 3 production sites in the UK. Aston Martin, as a small volume manufacturer, by definition that means someone that makes less than 10,000 cars a year. We have traditionally made a British product, but over the years the components that go into our cars have become less British, and that's been through a number of reasons, through cost, availability. You can't buy from a supplier that isn't here, and after the sort of 70s and 80s in the automotive sector, many of the tier 1s and tier 2s sadly departed these shores. But we look at the future, and as Beverly was saying, we look at new powertrains, new materials, composite material manufacturing, autonomy and connectivity, and the next generation of components. We see great opportunity for the UK. The government see great opportunity for the UK. They've put a lot of money and investment into R&D. We just need to see some greater support and greater energy in attracting either that inward investment or that startup business being able to develop themselves from SME through to mid-scale supplier. So reshoring for us is nothing to be patriotic about. It's just good common sense. We'd like to have a completely British supply chain if that was cost effective. Much shorter logistical supply chains. And I think Brexit and COVID-19 have shone a light very strongly on supply chains. I've spent a lot of my time over the past few months dealing with consulates and embassies around the world to ensure that we can get our components out of certain countries. If we had a UK supplier supplying us, I wouldn't have needed to do that. Brexit, adds a complexity of tariffs and border delays. So again, we are now as a company, not through just simply a lack of want, we are looking very seriously at what reshoring looks like for Aston Martin to ensure that we can make the right products, the right luxury products that we can export around the world for the 21st century. So we're really encouraged by the debate and discussion today. I'm glad to take part.
Thanks so much, James. Thanks for that. Really interesting issues that you raised there in terms of sort of pretty much every aspect of your supply chain in terms of the changing demands of the consumer at present. So I'd like to lastly, in terms of our panelists, come to Roger Willison-Gray as Corporate Relations Director at IORMA. Roger, you're a turnaround specialist. You've obviously confronted the issues around supply chains in lots of different areas and sectors. And I just wondered if you could give us a little bit of an overview about why this is such an important area from your perspective.
Thank you. I'm probably the odd one out on the panel in that I don't come from a manufacturing background. I am a digital transformation specialist and have worked in tech industries for well over 30 years. The investment that is needed in the UK industry and also specifically in the manufacturing sector is significant. There are some excellent best practices, and I'm not picking these for any particular reason, but Airbus is an example of how you can have an integrated supply chain spread over a multinational geography for very complex delivery, but you do need deep pockets to play that game, and we need to have a revolution in the mid sector, not just in the global supranationals. One of the things that struck me during the COVID-19 emergency, if you like, I was speaking to a friend of the family who is a central heating engineer, and I asked him how things were going, and he said, "Well, it's not the virus that's the issue. We can't get spare parts for boilers. So really simple components, valves and small mechanical components for heating systems were just not available, and so." It was almost like our economy was being held to ransom, and I'm a big advocate of Industry 4.0, smart factories. It's been possible for many years to integrate the supply chain, and again, there are some good examples. Bombardier put in place extensive systems to connect the customer to the manufacturing process. But using very expensive technology. What has happened over the last 4 or 5 years is accessibility to that technology has been improved dramatically by the reduction in price. So if you look at the impact of any technological change, it's not the technology about how clever it is, it's about how affordable it is, and that applies to computing, Internet of Things, CNC machines, smart factories, etc. And just as a really simple example, when the first autonomous vehicle was put together as a prototype, the LiDAR sensors, which basically allow it to be autonomous, were approximately $500,000 each. They're now in the region of a couple of $1,000s. So that just changes the landscape dramatically. What I find is that leaders in non-technical disciplines are not keeping pace with the change, and I think we need to address how can we do it better. If we're going to compete with the outsourced nations that we've used for many years now, the only thing we can compete on is price, and therefore we've got to be able to do more with less. And technically it's possible. IORMA's involved with a number of initiatives where the whole supply chain can be digitized, and therefore a huge amount of effort can be taken out of it in terms of human effort, and things can be automated. And really, that's where IORMA's perspective on the sort of reshoring is. How can we enable our businesses to take advantage of the opportunities that exist?
Thanks so very much for that, Roger. I think that's a tremendously interesting last point, actually, that you raise in terms of digitization, the impact of AI, and indeed robotics. I mean, I think it's quite interesting to see that the UK is actually below the world average for robotics intensity. And I wondered about industrial strategy and whether we have focused enough beyond R&D and transport investment, which I understand is the bulk of investment around the last industrial strategy's 142 actions. And I just wondered if Roger, maybe you'd just sort of give us a first thought on that to pick up on your last point.
I have quite a strong personal opinion on this. I believe it's underinvestment in education that is our fundamental problem. And I don't mean formal education. So just as an example, as an organisation set up in Ireland, which has got some traction in the UK as well, called Coda Dojo, where these are kind of after-school clubs where children are brought together not to consume technology, but to create it. And things like the Raspberry Pi, which is a very small, cheap computer. I was talking to a factory owner not long ago, and he said to me, well, the problem with robotics is, I've got to invest millions. And so I said, well, what do you know about robotics? And I said, have you ever, done anything practical with one? And he said, well, we can't afford it. So I said, you can buy a 3-axis robot arm and a computing operating system from Amazon for about £200. And that will give you the knowledge you need to develop the applications that you would then be able to scale up for your organization. But we treat robotics and AI to a degree as a super science that only PhD students could possibly ever understand. And actually, it's pretty straightforward, basic coding.
Well, yeah, very interested to hear
really
that.
We really do need to change our approach.
Yeah, okay, well, very interested to hear that, because I think what you're raising, Julia is signaling she wants to come in, so I think you're sort of heading, though, in the direction of the skills shortages that I know absolutely every single part of our manufacturing sector confronts. So, Julia, do you want to just jump in there?
Yes, thank you. Just sort of taking on Roger's point there about, sort of small companies adopting automation, etc. And I do agree with you, Beverly, that the UK is lagging behind in that. However, we do have, things that we should be using, and I wonder how many companies are actually realizing the opportunities there with automated companies who can come in and do that and show you the return on your investment by looking at automation. So they will help you through this. Companies these days are not just out to sell, they're looking for a solution to provide, and it's very important for their future that this is done. So automation, I agree, is very, very important for our own industries in engineering. We should all be looking at these and at least seeing where we can bring in part automation within our processes. Also, that we've got the catapult centres set up by the government to support industry, and it should be sort of realised, like places like the AMRC and the Manufacturing Technology Catapult Centre in Anstey Park have terrific training centres. I know these are just two that I'm quoting, but there are other training centres. But they highlight the skills that can be given to these young people, the enthusiasm, they're taught how to behave at work as well. So, companies can come in and see them and see what's actually happening. We don't seem to be, I know it's time to take out to do these, but, opportunities are there. We've also got the talent retention scheme, which will be absolutely essential for engineers losing, unfortunately, some of their jobs. And this is a terrific thing that was originally set up through BEIS and the Secretary of State at the time to help and not lose these important engineers that you know, that other companies can find them and come to. The automotive industry, James will, I'm sure, agree that, you know, it's considered a sexy industry, so that they often get quite a lot of apprentices that want to work for them. But, you know, they could help us maybe by saying to them, well, look, you know, you need to support us. We can't take you on, but you need to support that supply chain. I'm sure they do in some ways, but, you know, here are great opportunities. What the Chancellor announced yesterday for the young people is very important, to get them in, to give them an opportunity to start work, to help them to interface, and let's hope a lot go into engineering.
I think I might just need to, thanks so much for that, Julia, but I'd just like to come to James, because James, earlier, before this session, you were talking about some of the challenges around reshoring, onshoring for your company, given that many of the parts aren't even made in this country, as you move to a green powertrain, for example, but you're having to buy parts from China, where the energy is produced from coal-fired power stations, with the parts shipped halfway across the globe. I wanted to ask you two things, really. What do you see as the key challenges in terms of reshoring for Aston Martin? And how do you see being able to access the skills for the future, given the digitization and the robotics discussion that we've just been looking at?
Well, that's quite a question, Beverly, or several questions lumped together. Okay, let me try and unpick that. So I think yes, it's somewhat ironic to the move to electric cars, which is ultimately the end game for, I think, the majority of car manufacturers. I honestly can't see you know, any car manufacturer making a non-electrified product in the sort of next 20 years. So moving in that direction, it is a little bit ironic that we have to buy components from the other side of the world, where they're made in an unethical way, perhaps. I'm not saying all of them are, but labour and human rights rules and regulations in some countries in the Far East, Africa, etc., aren't as robust as they are in the UK. And then we are seeing, you know, batteries in the case of China, as you mentioned, Beverly, manufactured using coal, electricity generated using coal. And obviously a battery pack has a huge amount of energy that goes into its manufacture. So shipping that battery pack from the other side of the world adds just greater energy to it. So VW actually has a very interesting slide that shows that an e-Golf versus a Golf diesel. The e-Golf has such a high CO2 footprint from its inception, when it's driven off the forecourt, that it would take 100,000 kilometers for the e-Golf to average that out and actually start to become a cleaner vehicle than the diesel. That's amazing. So to actually make legitimately clean vehicles, we need the supply chain in the UK. We need to truncate that supply chain. And clearly we're going to have to get the rare earth metals, the commodities from further afield. We just simply don't have them in this country. But where we're looking at fuel, whether that be electricity generated on the grid, it needs to be green. If it's hydrogen, it needs to be green hydrogen and not blue hydrogen, which is obviously the differences between using renewable power and using non-renewable power. And we need to see the batteries built here and the other components. Our former CEO, Andy Palmer, used to often wax lyrical as the sort of the father behind the Nissan Leaf. Both he and I used to work at Nissan. And he used to say, you know, James, to make an efficient electric car, you need three things. You need the right power electronics, which everyone focuses on. You need to reduce drag, which few people focus on, and you need to ship weight, and that nobody focuses on that. Making a steel-based electric car is illogical. You need to take the weight out of it. And actually what we have in the UK is a great experience and great supply base in lightweighting. We have Formula One, we have lots of motorsport, we have aerospace companies all working in this field. What we need to do is invest in that to see these companies be able to scale up and make these components in a larger volume way. At the moment, it's only companies like Aston Martin, McLaren, and the more luxurious or performance businesses that can afford to put those components into their vehicles. We need to scale up. that was question one, I think. On the skills, yeah, we can't buy something from a supplier that doesn't exist. And as I said, in the 70s and 80s, parts of the automotive supply chain died with British Leyland. Those commodities, alloy wheels is often an example used, where the alloy wheel manufacturer is shipped out to Asia, and it's just too expensive to bring back. So we should, in some respects, accept that we've lost that, but look to the future, look where we have our strengths. And as I said, we have great strength in materials, and we have great small businesses up and down the country that are supplying both aerospace and automotive, and they could supply both, not either or. We could look to the development of batteries, look to the development of the synthetic fuels, the power sources that we need, and also look to the connected autonomous technologies. We are in a very, very interesting but very challenging arena in automotive, where we have essentially two paradigm shifts. One in terms of powertrain, the adaptation for the change from internal combustion to electric, and the other one is through connectivity and autonomy. The car is becoming a tool, a mobility device rather than an analog device. So we have great opportunity here, but we do need to make sure we've got the right skills. There's no point having businesses come here, because they won't come here if we haven't got the right people. So we need the investment in training and education, apprenticeships, as well as the investment to try and attract these businesses. And I think, last thing I'll say is too much attention from government is typically focused on the you've heard the term gigafactory, which is just a battery. I often use the analogy that that's a Duracell AA. We actually need the stuff that goes around it, because that's where we can really get the most value.
Oh, that's very, very interesting, because I'm glad you raised the gigafactory, because obviously that has been a huge area of concentration, both here in the West Midlands, where I'm sitting, but more generally as well. I wonder, in terms of building the bit that goes around the gigafactory, do we need to shine a light much more on what competencies, capabilities, suppliers we actually have? And I wonder if I could address this back to you, James, again. How far does your understanding of your supply chain go? I mean, do you understand very much below tiers 2 and 3 and what there is in the supply chain?
It's very complicated, the supply chain, isn't it? Typically our tier ones are far larger businesses than we are. So it's a little bit ironic. We're a small company. We're supplied by Daimler, Bosch, Continental. These are monstrous organisations. Unipart, GKN, to name a few British companies to add to the mix for the purposes of the reshoring discussion. There are some British tier ones that we use, sadly not as many as we'd like. When you start to try and interrogate that from both a sustainability perspective, which sits in my portfolio at Aston Martin, to ensure that we are buying from ethical companies, and indeed to understand where the supply routes, so where our tier 3 is, where our tier 4 is. I think back at the beginning, Julia mentioned the volcanic ash cloud. Well, if you want to know where your components are coming, at tier 1, we're fine. They're a UK tier 1. Well, if all of the tier 2s are in Asia, then slight problem. So to answer your question in a very rambling way, it's very complicated, because typically tier 1s don't like telling you who the tier 2s are, because they assume that you're going to go around them.
I'd really like to ask Julia to come back then on how can we get more visibility, given exactly the point that James makes, that the OEMs don't like to sort of reveal, or the tier 1s don't like to reveal who's behind them. Can you give us any thoughts on that, Julia, given your position at GTMA?
Yes, we've experienced it actually. Yes, we've tried with JLR in particular to focus on that area at their instigation, in actual fact. So, this is important that they understand where the tiers do sit. And I think during the recent situation that we've had, where the SMEs stepped up to the call for switching from perhaps their more familiar sector that they worked in to going into medical, they did it in a matter of days. And that's the flexibility that the SMEs, that lower tier, does have. Unfortunately, the tier 1s very often, and I think in particular, perhaps, James, it is in the automotive industry, excuse me, where the tier 1s are actually making that selection down the tiers. That is a very difficult one for us as associations to get through, that there is this layer of SMEs with the skills that still exist. And that's what reshoring is showing, or is demonstrating, is the volume of companies that can do different processes within the engineering requirements. So how else we can look at it is that we are very innovative in the UK, and we've got to somehow try and get these messages across to the manufacturers. The tier ones perhaps are quite difficult to break into, but we have to do that. We have to at least show them where they can dual source in the UK, and perhaps the OEMs can make some headway for us on that. Because when you look at the extent of these companies, they have some fantastic skills, but they are small companies. So the pressure on them is always passed down that supply chain. Enormous pressures are put on them to actually provide for the above tiers.
Well, I know that you're doing...
But we need, I'm hoping that maybe government can start to recognise that we've got a huge number of SMEs.
Yes, absolutely.
A small number of global, manufacturers. Very cool.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Julia. I mean, it is a really knotty problem, isn't it? Trying to sort of see down below the tier ones and through our supply chains, and the massive array of competencies and the total flexibility offered. I mean, I'd like to address a question to Roger Willison-Gray about how could we use public procurement more to actually harness more effectively our tremendous capacity and capability through our SMEs, and really create a sort of circular effect in terms of making that public funding actually work properly. What would you say to that, Roger?
You won't like my response. There are two things that governments of any particular flavour are appallingly bad at. One is procurement, and the second is anything technological. And there are dozens of projects and wreckage in the rear mirror of where things have gone dramatically wrong. I live in East Anglia, and the local LEP recently announced a recovery plan for the region. And I'm a member of a number of networking groups, and we reviewed the recovery plan, which admitted that 59% of all the commercial activity in the area is in companies employing less than 10 people. And we concluded at the end of it, there wasn't one single initiative that would help any of them, and that all of the effort was being directed to the 3% of businesses that account for about 30% of economic activity. And the reason politicians and government organisations do that is because it's easy. It's difficult to reach the SMEs. It requires imagination, effort. But what I would say is there's one LEP that I really think does a fantastic job, and that's Derby and Nottingham. It runs a growth hub called D2N2, and they are a gold standard for how to communicate with the SME community. Sadly, many others aren't.
Right.
Right. I think we've got to find a way of business interacting and being able to access funding. I'll give you a really good example. I work with a couple of investment organisations, and I was asked to review a project recently for a UK company from London. They've developed an electric bike, and it is the sexiest electric bike I've ever seen. It wouldn't be out of place with an Aston Martin badge on it. I thought, wow, that's impressive. And I looked through the business plan, and they're manufacturing in Nigeria. And I thought, that's odd. And when I looked into it, it's because of the trade tariffs that there are on batteries from China. They can actually manufacture these things 30% cheaper in Lagos, but their market's in the UK. So the investors have backed that project. They're going to get the funding and everything else. But that's a story I come across again and again. Brilliant ideas, brilliant design, unable to get investment, look to overseas investors, and then the manufacturing goes offshore. And I have to say, as a nation, we are very poor at investing in innovation. In the Bay Area in San Francisco, there's in the region of 1,000 unicorns that have been identified. So businesses which will turn over $1 billion in the next 3 years. I can't think of a single tech unicorn in the UK, not one.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I think it's very sad, that last comment, actually, because when you think that we have just given away millions and millions in grants, but we haven't really looked at the opportunities for new equity funds that could be actually investing just a small proportion of that, perhaps in some of the technology opportunities that we are discussing here. And Roger, I'm quite glad, and I wasn't wholly disappointed in your answer. You might be pleased to hear. I'm quite glad that you mentioned politicians, because one of our questions, and I'd just like to appeal to our audience to try and make the questions short, because when you're trying to moderate and read the questions, it's just slightly beyond me, I have to say. But one of the questions has looked at, is there a role here for giving more teeth to our APPGs, our all-party parliamentary groups? Can we somehow infiltrate these groups and let them understand what are some of these key problems, whether it's around funding, reshoring, the areas we've been discussing? Roger, can I come back to you on that one? And then I'll come to Julia. I see you want to, yeah.
Yeah, sure. In fact, IORMA is very active in this space, and one of my colleagues, Jane Calvert-Lee, and others are involved in several APPGs, and we are trying very much to bring that perspective. I think all of us need to extend that lobbying. That's one route, but there is a lot of money that comes out the EIS schemes and so on. And, you know, James's point of view of you can't engage a supplier that doesn't exist. We should be finding ways to appeal to ecosystems like Aston Martin, say, how can we build the connectivity and the network to be able to deliver to the organizations that are creating the demand? And I just feel that isn't there.
No. Okay, Julia, can I come to you, because you wanted to come in on that point?
Yes, one of the areas is the catapult centers. You know, they have all the technology, they have the opportunity to engage. They are financed with large projects that they succeed with, but I'm sure they suffer as well, that there's no continuity. So one project gets an answer, why isn't that developed? Which could, in actual fact, then embrace the SME community. And more engagement with the SME communities, I think, is a very important part of the catapult centres. Surely that's what they've been set up to do, to work with the large companies, but to bring the interface from the SMEs to link up with them. And I really do think that these centres are fantastic. I expect, Beverly, you've seen them, and so many of our members have seen them also. Why aren't we using that? Why isn't it being given out more to help the industry to succeed in the UK, rather than them to be looking and having to look after themselves and employ? They employ huge numbers of people, these catapult centres. Surely we should be getting something more out from the development that is going on there.
Okay, may I just take that point then and address it to James, because the catapults obviously are comparatively new in the UK, let's say in comparison to the Fraunhofer in Germany. The Fraunhofer have a very long-term perspective. They invest in idea creation, from idea right through to product marketization. I wonder if you feel that we've got that sort of continuity of perspective in terms of this whole reshoring agenda through the catapults, James.
Oh, yes. I mean, I guess the political winds change and the focus changes. I mean, I guess for us it's very difficult. The transport systems catapult is no more. It's been merged with another. So you suddenly have an entity that had a clear plan and companies were able to engage with it. it, and then the focus, the direction changes, and suddenly it's different. You mentioned industrial strategy at the beginning, Beverly. Has anyone heard this government talk about industrial strategy? I mean, frankly, for me, the silence is deafening. It's very, very sad that both automotive, aerospace, key sectors for the UK economy, and there are others, but two that I work with quite closely, had sector deals, and through COVID-19 there's been very little sector support. We've all heard of the challenges that aerospace specifically is in, and automotive are probably less impacted than aerospace. But again, we should be linking back to the industrial strategy. It's a document that should stand the test of time, and unfortunately I think the political change we've gone through over the past half dozen years through various governments has been incredibly difficult for companies to continue to pick their way through, because the strategy changes. It literally is almost on an annual basis.
It is very difficult when things chop and change. And one of our questioners has just highlighted the 500 million stake, an example of the UK's 500 million stake in a private Indian company acquisition of a London-based satellite communications company as a precedent for wider application. And they ask, should more SMEs with something to offer be approaching Aston Martin and similar companies more than they are? I mean, would equity as an option that perhaps through OEMs like yourself could be incentivized, would that be a way of unearthing the capacity that's out there in the supply chain? James, back to you, if you understand.
Well, it's a difficult one, and obviously OEMs have, you know, the central point. You know, we're a business that makes cars. We're not a business that makes components. So obviously through our supply chain team, where we have a supplier that's in difficulty or a supplier that is challenged, we will look to support them, and every OEM will be the same. But you know, we would be diversifying our business too much. We outsource the component manufacturer to suppliers who it's their bread and butter to do these things. So I think the satellite, I think that's an interesting analogy. But from a company perspective, for Aston Martin to go and buy a particular company, we're not at that scale. You've seen in some of the new emerging technology, greater and greater consolidation in the automotive sector, and where there hasn't been direct consolidation, you've seen VW and Ford start to tie up on new technology development. As I mentioned, the paradigm shifts in connectivity are so expensive that big OEMs, massive OEMs, you know, just can't afford to do it themselves. So they're looking to either acquire or to work seamlessly with others. And again, on the flip side, you've seen likes of Google, Apple, and sadly for Dyson, tech companies put their toe in the water and say they're going to make a car, and they realise that actually the margins available in the car industry are nowhere near what they are in the tech sector. And they, I think, a little bit sad for James Dyson, he got that bit too far down the road, which is a great loss for the UK. But it's.
Well, I wonder. I'd just like to ask you, James. I mean, given you mentioned the lack of sectoral support from the government at the moment, given the crisis that we're in, what could be done that would help the automotive, fantastically important sector? April sales down 99.7%. What could the government do, and how could that help this business of the reshoring that we're talking about today?
Yeah, okay, so there's, I mean, I take this in two parts. I think it's a very simple way, and I will paraphrase this with the caveat that I'm not an economist, but that probably puts me in a unique place where I can talk intelligently about economics, with hopefully disrespect to any economists on the phone. I think they try and boil the oceans too often. To be honest, to get people moving and buying high cost items, we don't need to have a specific automotive scheme, in my humble opinion. A VAT cut, a simple VAT cut is a confidence boost to go and buy a fridge freezer, a car, a dishwasher, anything that you might think, actually, I'm not sure where my next paycheck's coming from, I'll put it off until next year. Fortunately, the majority of our consumers tend to ride out the normal ups and downs of economic cycles, but this year it's not a normal up and down of an economic cycle. So in terms of how to get things moving now, I think a small VAT cut would have been a sensible choice for the Chancellor to make. Sadly, he didn't make that. In terms of how we can, support the domestic development of the industry, we used to have two great schemes back in pre-2010. One called Regional Growth and one called AMSCI. AMSCI was the Advanced Manufacturing Supply Chain Initiative, and there are pockets. I have a funding hat on at Aston Martin. I'm in charge of going out and trying to find money, to find partners to work with, to apply for this money. And more often than not, with the footprint we have in the UK, I will find. I'll give you two examples. I wanted to do a project on R&D. There was no direct money in the local NEP bucket. It was a project that wasn't compliant through the Advanced Propulsion Centre. SEMLEP, where we have a footprint, had some money available, but we weren't going to do the project in the SEMLEP area because that's where we have our traditional old school, what we call our heritage business, where we make cars from the 40s and 50s and repair them. Another example, we wanted to do a supply chain activity in Warwickshire. The Greater Birmingham and Solihull LEP had a small AMSCI pot. Again, we don't have a footprint in Birmingham. So the illogical thing is we've devolved too much of the decisions down to the very, very local area. That means that you've got pockets of support that companies in a particular area can draw upon, but no national framework. So I think to be honest, if you were to rebuild the AMSCI scheme and offer that up, that is, we win when our supply chain win. If our supply chain loses, ultimately we're going to lose. So if we can have a fund like AMSCI that helps build up the domestic supply chain, takes it from the SME or from the S to the M, or allows a company to build up from supplying aerospace to supplying automotive. There's a question on the Q&A from a gentleman that supplies some of our some components to us in the lightweighting area, but if you can take that, it's all about scale. If you can help that gentleman and his business get up to a point where they are able to supply not just Aston Martin, but maybe even Jaguar Land Rover, there's a huge gap between us and them in terms of volume. And a small family business, that's putting your house on the line. So AMSCI was a really good way of seeing the supply chain build. Regional growth was obviously focused at more larger companies and allows us to invest in our own equipment. Without it, frankly, it's been very, very piecemeal. The devolved administrations, we have our facility in Wales. You get a lot more engagement from Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. They have a lot more flexibility and a lot more oomph to get stuff done than sadly the UK government has.
That's really, really interesting. Well, I do want to go to the questions and make sure I try and get a few in. And sorry, Julia, I will come back to you, but one of the questions that is being asked at the moment is procurement, supply chain, digital development, a live dashboard to showcase capability coupled with capacity. Could the panel discuss, would this functionality ease reshoring as a process? And I'd like to go to Roger initially, and then I'll come to you, Julia, if I may, after that. Roger, would you like to talk about a sort of live dashboard, digitally enabled dashboard?
Yeah, it's potentially quite a big question, but I think in principle, the more information that is available to people for effective analysis, the better. The difficulty, I think, it comes from the point James has just made, that, and I totally endorse everything he said, but in particular, initiatives like catapult centres are not co-located in Norwich, and if the funding's regional and the leadership's regional, it's very difficult to take advantage of national initiatives. So yes, more investment, better information, absolutely, but it's got to be done by somebody.
Okay, thanks very much. And Julia, digitally enabled dashboards, easing capability in terms of identifying suppliers.
I don't know whether I can go there quite so quickly. Yes, obviously anything that helps in that way I would endorse. However, I was sort of pointing out what James was saying about, how Northern Ireland, I was really impressed by visiting there, and Northern Ireland has joined the Reshoring Network. They see the advantage. They're working, Wrightbus are doing the hydrogen fuel cells and delivering buses, and going to be delivering buses into the UK, the rest of the UK. I think Northern Ireland is important on the aerospace industry. Well, they'll be looking, what are they going to do for the cross-industry sectors? And that hits, as I said before, the SME community. And that's where we need to support and build up the SMEs so that they move up that ladder and grow. I think James mentioned that. We need to develop that area. I would go back again to all that money into the catapult centres. You know, they're building a new they've built a new lightweight up in Strathclyde. They're building a hydrogen fuel cell catapult up in Scotland as well, because obviously that's where it's going. You know, we've got tremendous opportunities within the UK. And I think sometimes regionalizing things stifles that ability to find these companies.
I agree.
I'm saying the Reshoring UK is covering all the devolved regions and where all the different companies sit and have all the skills that more than likely could help us out of this. It will be the SMEs and their dynamism to actually move forward that will help us to come out of this, because they make up the majority of companies in the UK. So
well, I think one of the questions...
I can't answer the other question without some thought to that.
No, that's fair enough. I mean, one of the questions, though, is really talking about ecosystems. And I think if we did start to think about ecosystems more logically, perhaps, then you might have a strategy nationally which linked into a regional capacity to deliver that and some ability to be flexible. But this particular question is saying that catapults are expensive. The other regional technology organizations, universities and so forth can also help SMEs, but the coordinated ecosystem doesn't exist. Is this a BEIS responsibility? I'm being asked here. Roger, would you be able to come back on that one, please?
Yeah, the easy questions first. I think it comes down to ultimately political direction, and it's been noted. I echo, I think, James's point about where's the industrial strategy. We've been a service economy for nearly all of my life. I was beginning my career in the doldrums of the 1970s, so I know what bad manufacturing looks like. And I don't think we've ever really recovered. And I think as a business person, you know, you can put all of the philosophy to one side. If I've got a business selling coat hangers, I need somebody to manufacture coat hangers, and I'm going to go to whoever can do it for the best quality price point. And if I can't find a UK manufacturer that will do that for me, I'll go to China. And that's true of nearly every business decision that's taken. So the only people can really influence that outcome is through political direction that says, actually, how can we provide the ecosystem to enable, high tech's great, aerospace, automotive, satellites, lovely, and we're good at that stuff, and it's an important part of our economy. But the other 70% isn't that high tech. So we need to manufacture valves for boilers, coat hangers. I was going to say plastic carrier bags. Let's say natural cotton carrier bags, or whatever product that we're seeking to develop, and have that philosophy that, I look around the place where I live and the people that I know, and hardly anybody I know makes anything for a living. And yeah, we've got to change that.
No, absolutely. Well, I want to return to actually this point of the digital dashboard. Somebody's asked an interesting question quite close to my heart. It says the multi-company MAN group, which was the Manufacturing Advisory Network, if I remember correctly, is a successful attempt by smaller companies to capture projects from large companies because the group appears large to the buyer and can supply many facets that one individual company alone cannot. With so many SMEs, why are there so few MAN groups? And I think that might be something to do with the ability of companies to club together, organize themselves. But it is interesting seeing that question, because Julia and I were actually discussing this yesterday, along with a tremendously innovative initiative which Warwick Manufacturing Group, WMG, started about 20 years ago, called the West Midlands Collaborative Commerce Marketplace, which was an online virtual enterprise network. And it was something that we never really picked up as a nation, as an idea. It was enabling companies to come together, collaborate, and tenders were pumped down the network regularly in the year. And apparently the companies that were part of that network, there was 13,000 registered companies that I recall, and about £6 billion of business was done through the network. But our country, having had sort of pump primed that initiative as a piece of research, didn't really pick it up and make anything of it, even though it was about 20 years ago. And Singapore apparently did. And Singapore is the top nation in terms of the percentage of robotics intensity per head. And I just wonder if we really are falling behind, and if so, you know, if I could ask as a sort of last question to each panelist, what in a nutshell would you recommend as your core piece of advice to the government if there was one thing that we should really be focusing on? And I'd like to start with Julia first, please. Oh, Julia, you're muted, by the way. Sorry, can you unmute?
Yes. Well, obviously, this is what we've attempted to do. Reshoring UK is bringing together companies through the trade associations. So the interface is with the trade associations. I said at the very beginning, the trade associations are a resource that we have not used in the UK. I just can't. They've been going for years. You know, ours is 75 years old. You know, others are 100 years old. They've been there as the supply chain. We were set up as a supply chain back in 1942. So, you know, we are always looking at opportunities to work together, to support the industry, to help manufacturers free of charge to find these companies. And we do. We've had inquiries over the last few weeks that we've all been at home. We've been working really hard on helping companies to find companies in the UK. And this is what the Reshoring Network can do in a very simple way. It's also sustainable because the trade associations know their companies. And that's a very important part. So we can work with the manufacturers. What we've got to do is engage with the manufacturers. And I hope that, you know, government and the government strategy will look at the bottom end where all the companies sit to support our manufacturers, so that we do still have manufacturing in this country, and we have the engineering skills that are still there now. But if they're not used, we're going to start losing as well. So
yes, all right. Well, I'd like to, because we haven't got very many minutes. So Roger, could you give us your final thought on what one key thing would you recommend to government?
I'm not sure it's a recommendation to government, but I remember growing up, the products used to have a Union Jack stuck on them, and it said "Made in Britain." And my grandmother, and I'm not saying this is the right answer, but my grandmother, if it said "Made in Hong Kong," she wouldn't buy it. You know, maybe we don't need to be quite as xenophobic as that, but there's nothing wrong with celebrating our ability to make things and to at least balance the service economy so that we've got investment in manufacturing. And that's the message to the government, is you need to make this work as part of our economy.
That's a really excellent answer. And James, I think the final point to you, you've got a couple of minutes if you'd like to give us some thoughts from Aston Martin perspective. What key thing would you be recommending?
I think I'd go back to my last point, to be honest. I think we have great skills, we have great companies, we have great opportunities, certainly in automotive for the UK. To do that, we need to help companies not only join up, but I take Julia and Roger's points. You know, Julia mentioned that the trade associations being able to collate and coalesce around a single message and a single identity. But we need government to support those companies in scaling up. To be honest, every time I sit down with a supplier and we try and work out how can we make this work in the UK, how do we, Aston Martin, develop the next technology in the UK? The answer is always, well, we haven't got enough money, it's too expensive, or the scale isn't right. And for us as a company, we don't want 100,000, 1 million of a widget. We want 5,000, which means the piece cost is too high. So you either go and buy it from a to add on to an existing program somewhere else in the world, which means it's lost to the UK. We don't do it. So I think my final thought for the day would be, AMSCI was a good scheme. It was focused at building up the supply chain. The trade associations, the Automotive Council, the SMMT, Julia's organisation, Make UK, they know where the opportunities are. Talk to them. Put a scheme, put some real money behind it. And I don't mean 10 million. I mean, put several zeros on the end of that if you want to exploit the opportunities that are there today. Otherwise, it'll be Germany, it'll be France, and we'll just continue to buy from wherever it's made.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, a couple of really big themes coming through there in terms of consistency of government policy, of a longer term perspective of some serious investment in our manufacturing economy, which, let's face it, is the best amongst the best in the world, but has been underinvested in for so many years. I think belief in the people who make it work, it's high time that we saw some more of that. So I would very much like to thank everybody who's contributed a question. Apologies that I didn't get to them all. I think there were many, many questions I didn't get to, but thanks so much. Fascinating discussion. Thanks so much to our panelists, to Julia Moore, GTMA Chief Executive, to James Stevens from Aston Martin, and to Roger Willison-Gray of IORMA. And before we close, because I think we're pretty much on 3 o'clock now, I'd just like to say the next webinar is on Thursday, the 23rd of July, at 2 p.m. and it's on the future of film. So I do hope that anybody out there interested will sign up. It'll be another fascinating discussion, and thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beverly, and thank you to all our participants for your questions and your participation. I think we've had a really great and satisfying and thought-provoking session this afternoon. This session is being recorded, and the recording will be made available within the next 48 hours. Also, the questions that we had submitted, we will try and deal with offline. So those of you who haven't had your question answered, please bear with us, and IORMA will be getting back to you with some kind of answer from the panelists. So I'd like to thank Beverly for her excellent moderation of this event, and our excellent panelists. Those of you who are signing off now, and I would ask you to do that, when you sign off, you will be directed to a survey form. And on this survey form, we'll be asking you for your feedback from this session, and also any thoughts and ideas that you might have for future sessions that you would like to see from IORMA webinars. So finally, in conclusion, once again, thank you to all our panelists and our participants, and we very much look forward to seeing you at our next webinar in a fortnight's time. Thank you.